When we left off last time, we were talking about President Obama's plan to provide free community college education. And now we have seen thus far that it is impossible for anything to be free. Somebody's got to pay for it. You pay for some things you pay for with time, sitting there waiting. Some things you pay for directly with money. And some things you pay for by the only institution in America legally allowed to use force coming to you and saying, we have decided that what is best for your money is for it to be taken from you with the threat of force, because if you don't pay, there will be force, and we're going to redirect your money to someone else. Now, this proposal, I'm going to get to the State of the Union address in just a second. President Obama called for increasing the capital gains tax rate on couples making more than $500,000 annually to 28%. The current tax rate is 23.8%. It was 20 when he came into office. The President's plan would also require estates to pay capital gains taxes on securities at the time they're inherited and slap a fee on the roughly 100 U.S. financial firms with assets of more than $50 billion. Much of the $320 billion in new taxes and fees would be used for measures aimed at helping the middle class, including a $500 tax credit for some families with two spouses. How many of you are currently not married? Not married. Okay. No tax cut for you. Expansion of the child care tax credit. How many of you do not have children? No tax cut for you. And $60 billion to make community college free. How many of you think you'll probably be out of community college before this passes? No tax cut for you. Okay, so first of all, we're going to see in just a little bit two other presidents, one Democrat, one Republican, that had very different ideology on taxes, on the direction they should go, and who should get them. A lot of economists refer to what he's proposing here, we refer to it as social engineering, meaning you will get a tax cut if you are engaging in activities we, the government, believe are good. Not just a tax cut, but if you're both working, we believe that. If you're married and you're both working, we believe that's good. Here's a tax cut. If you have children and you want to put them in daycare, we think that's good. You get to keep some of your money. And if you pick community college to have something else, you get to keep some of your money. If you are not married, you don't have kids, you're not going to community college, we're taking your money, no tax cut for you. All right, so this is a form of government deciding, think about it, of the two places every dollar you earn can go. One is in your pocket, one is to the Internal Revenue Service in Washington, D.C. What we're going to do today is talk about the philosophy of who uses those dollars best, and we're also going to get into the mathematics and economics of whether or not the $320 billion in new revenues he's saying he wants to use to do these things will actually show up. Now, as a brief review from last time, you recall when we were talking about free community college education, from a couple of classes ago, you recall us talking about the problem of scarcity, and it was very clear, it's very clear what the President is wanting to do here. He's saying, okay, here's a typical rich person. Okay, let's say this is Mark Zuckerberg. Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, has approximately $29 billion. According to President Obama, he needs less. Whatever that is, whatever the President might say anybody should be able to live on. So the rich have more than they need. So when it comes to financial scarcity, a lot of politicians who support President Obama would argue that rich people don't face financial scarcity, even though other economists could say they do, because Zuckerberg might have $29 billion, but he'd rather have 50. And he's got, as we mentioned last week, he's got to hire 1,100 new workers and grow Facebook to get to $50 billion. Okay, so for the middle class, here's how much we have in terms of dollars. Here's how much we need, because the President is showing a concern for us, saying we need more to pay for community college. We need more if we're both working. We need more if we have children. So the President is proposing, if we sum up all billionaires, he's proposing shaving off $320 billion of wealth from people like Mark Zuckerberg and sending that down here to us to bring up what we have by $320 billion to close the gap so we can take better care of our children, have more money if we have two spouses working, and have free community college education. So he's proposing to deal with the problem of scarcity by taking from those who have to send it to those who have not, and I'm sure somewhere Robin Hood would be very pleased. Now back to reality, ladies and gentlemen. So this proposal hinges on something critical. It hinges on two things. Number one, is it constitutional? We talked about that last time. A strict interpretation of the Madison view of the Constitution is very clear. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the Constitution does not provide, as you remember Madison saying, I cannot undertake to lay my finger on that article of the Constitution which granted a right to Congress of expending on objects of benevolence the money of their constituents. So providing free community college education is not in the Constitution. It's not even implied in the Constitution. There was such thing as education in 1787. It was assumed you wanted your kids educated, pay for it. You're the ones who created them. You saw in the Curse of Alexander Hamilton lecture that in 1935 the United States Supreme Court sided with Alexander Hamilton's opinion of the definition of the General Welfare Clause. The exact wording of their decision was given in the speech and is in your book, where the Supreme Court, under the threat of Franklin Roosevelt packing the court with more justices, weakening their power, panicked, if you will, and declared for the first time since 1787, and bear in mind the Supreme Court before 1935 had ruled unconstitutional many of Franklin Roosevelt's programs designed to take from one to give to another. But in 1935, in the Butler case, they picked Alexander Hamilton as the sole authority on the definition of the general welfare. And from 1936, because 1936 the decision was handed down, from 1936 running through today, the federal government can do whatever it wants with your money, and it is viewed by the Constitution as being constitutional. So when people say to me, for example, Obamacare is not constitutional, I ask them, well, under which interpretation? The original construct of that document or the modern Supreme Court interpretation of it? The modern Supreme Court interpretation of free community college education is that it is constitutional. Because after all, if Alexander Hamilton would hear, if he were here right now, Alexander Hamilton would say, Professor Chambliss, does this new law providing for free community college education mean that all babies born after a certain point, once they desire college, if they pick community college, will all American babies have access to this? And the answer is yes. And then Alexander Hamilton would say, well, then this does promote the general welfare because all American babies, upon turning 17 or 18, will have access to free community college education. And he would argue this is exactly why in the Constitution I argued for a broad interpretation of the phrase. Of course, Madison, he's been rolling over in his grave since Bush and Obama were president, but Madison would be rolling over his grave, and so would Bastiat. Bastiat would say, please help me understand why it's okay to steal from Zuckerberg and the rest to provide community college education to young people. He wouldn't understand, Madison wouldn't understand, but the law of the land is clear. It is constitutional under the 1935 Butler case. So that's settled. As Mr. Obama has said before, there's no point in having stale arguments. Go back and go type in the phrase Obama, stale arguments. Every time somebody brings up the constitutionality of some new government program, he often refers back to these stale arguments. What he means is old, outdated arguments about the Constitution as it applies to spending. It's been settled. It's been settled for several decades. They can do whatever they want. So now that we know they can do whatever they want, let's find out if it's going to actually do what he says it's going to do. Now, President Obama is making an assumption when it comes to the relationship between tax revenue and tax rates. And by revenue, of course, we just mean the total money taken in through taxes. And by tax rate, we mean the percentage people are told to pay. He's making an assumption, and this is jumping over to chapter 4 momentarily, for those of you, in the purposes of your reading, want to go home and explore that the relationship between tax revenue and tax rates is positive. Meaning, very simply, if we had a 0% tax on capital gains, let's stop there for a moment. For those of you who don't know what a capital gains tax is, very simple. If you buy gold or silver, stocks or bonds, real estate, this sort of stuff, and you sell it and you earn a profit, you have realized, according to the government, something called a capital gain. And there's a tax on that. So it's a tax on investment income. It's a tax on the profit from your investments. Now, if the capital gains tax rate was 0%, how much revenue would the government take in? None. If they didn't tax investment income, they wouldn't get any revenue from investment income. Okay, if the tax was 15%, if they took 15% of your profit, as it was the case, we'll call this tax revenue under George W. Bush, because by the time his presidency came to a close, the capital gains tax rate had come down to 15%. There would be some revenue taken in from those investments. If the tax rate was 20%, so we'll call this TR under Bill Clinton. That was the capital gains tax rate under Clinton, okay? The argument is, well, if you are taking 20% of people's profit now, that will be even more money to do things. See, tax rate goes up, tax revenue goes up. If we go to 23.8, which is the rate now, that's what Mr. President Obama raised it to. So this would be tax revenue, Barack Obama phase 1. Phase 1, we get some revenue. He wants it to go to 28%. And there's a reason for 28, because this would be tax revenue, Barack Obama phase 2, and Ronald Reagan. And if you read it, you can Google it for yourself. There's a reason he picks 28. He often refers back to, well, this is what it was under Ronald Reagan, hoping to pull the teeth of Republicans who would say, we can't raise it that high. He can fall back and say, I'm just doing the same rate that your hero did. It was 28 under Reagan. I just want to take it back to that. We want the Reagan. And so you got to imagine how galling it would be for a lot of Republicans to argue this and then be able to say with accuracy, well, that's what it was under Reagan. Okay, so the assumption is that if you keep raising the rate, you'll get more revenue. And here we go. If we take it from 23.8 to 28, the gain in revenue is supposed to be somewhere around $320 billion, from which gets sent to middle-class families so their little kids can go off to community college. And of course, I'll have the joy of teaching people years from now who say, why did I get an F? This is free. You imagine that scenario. Wow, that's going to be so much fun. Okay, so now, if you look at this right away, you might say, well, there may be something off here. But I want to compliment Obama in one way. At least right now he's talking about getting money. I want to show you from YouTube how he defended raising the rate up to 23.8 before he even became president. So watch this. All right. So main PC, send to screens. Is the power on up there? Yes, no? Yes. Okay.
Said you would favor an increase in...
All right, so this is a debate between President Obama and Hillary Clinton when they were seeking the nomination for president.
All right. You have, however, said you would favor an increase in the capital gains tax. As a matter of fact, you said on CNBC, and I quote, I certainly would not go above what existed under Bill Clinton, which was 28%. It's now 15%. That's almost a doubling if you went to 28%. But actually, Bill Clinton in 1997 signed legislation that dropped the capital gains tax to 20%. Right. And George Bush has taken it down to 15%. And in each instance, when the rate dropped, revenues from the tax increased. The government took in more money. And in the 1980s, when the tax was increased to 28%, the revenues went down. So why raise it at all, especially given the fact that 100 million people in this country own stock and would be affected?
Well, Charlie, what I've said is that I would look at raising the capital gains tax for purposes of fairness.
Okay, he goes on to talk about how the secretaries of CEOs sometimes pay a higher tax bracket than the CEOs do. So his argument while he was running for president was to raise the capital gains tax rate for purposes of fairness. Now there's a dilemma there. I may have mentioned to you before that I don't even allow my children to utter the word because it can't be defined. Your view, your definition, if I were to ask everybody in this room, what is the fairest tax a person should pay on their investment income? I might get 35 different answers. And from you online students, I might get 100 different answers. Some of you might say 100%, so you're Karl Marx. Some of you might say you're 0%, you're Adam Smith, and all points in between. Okay, so that's the reason why I don't entertain the word in my house. Because any temptation to say, well, Dad, is this fair? I say, well, you're asking me to spin our wheels and waste my life for the next week defining the word. It's so subjective. So back then, he wanted to raise the rate. He didn't say anything about getting money. He didn't think about, well, my plan with the money would be to fix global warming or to make sure squirrels don't become an endangered species, something. He didn't talk about money at all. All he gave us was this word fairness. So at least now, to his credit, I suppose, he's talking about actually doing it because he wants money to fix a problem of people not being able to pay for community college education. Okay? So let's take a look at the assumption that creates the idea that he will actually get this money. I encourage you, all of you watching this right now, on your own, you can go back and go to Google and type in words like static versus dynamic scoring, and then you can type in taxes. It can be one word you can add to it. The acronym JCT would be useful. And here's why. Every time the government proposes a new tax, whether it's taxes going up or down, they send their proposal to a group called the Joint Committee on Taxation. This is the organization that is charged with the responsibility of estimating. Because, by the way, when you see the estimates of $320 billion, well, they haven't done it yet, have they? They haven't raised the rate yet, have they? No. So where do they get $320 billion? I mean, they just pull it. They don't pull it out of the clear blue sky. They've got a model they use to do these estimates. So the Joint Committee on Taxation is given responsibility to say, okay, here's the new tax rates we're proposing. We need you to run the numbers and come back to us and tell us what's going to happen to revenue. Now, the model the Joint Committee on Taxation uses is known as a static model. What does the word static mean? Unchanging. That's right. So let me show you what that looks like, and we'll talk about what happens when you use a static versus a dynamic model. Okay. Now, what I'm about to do up here is some algebra. And that means some of you are about to clutch your hearts like Fred Sanford and say, this is the big one. I'm coming to join you. Okay. In 2+ decades, I do not recall, actually I could say I have not forced students to do algebra. I wish I could. Valencia says no. So I'm just going to give you the structure of what's going on. And for those of you that had any exposure to algebra, you'll look at it and go, oh, that's useful. And I'll see where algebra can do something. You won't be like my sons, where am I ever going to use this? And if you've never had algebra, you can just sit back and say, okay, I think I'll listen to the words and maybe understand that. I don't understand what he's doing. And the words will be useful to you going forward. Okay. So if we were to take tax revenue, which is known as a dependent variable, and set it equal to an intercept term plus a coefficient on tax rates, which is an independent variable, plus, let's say, a coefficient on the gross domestic product, plus a coefficient on consumer income, and then plus ... BN, and then whatever our last variable is. This is a simple linear equation, okay, where the coefficient, when you when you run the algebra equation, it's called a multiple regression problem. You'll do this in graduate school. When you do this, it ends up spitting out numbers that tells you the relationship between your independent variable and your dependent variable. What I need you to understand is when you use a simple linear equation to run any model, you're left with the possibility that the relationship between any independent variable, and by the way, in Chapter 4, there's a discussion of independent and dependent variables, so that'll at least clear up conceptually what we're doing. It leaves you with the possibility of either a positive, negative, or no relationship between any of the independent and the dependent variables. You're going to either discover positive, negative, or zero. This is known as a static model. And this is similar to what the Joint Committee on Taxation uses. Now, for those of you who've had algebra, right now, your head should be spinning at the absurdity of using a static model when we're talking about taxes, because a static model means it assumes human behavior remains, what's the word static mean? The same. In other words, right? You charge us 23.8% on our investments, and we just keep making the same investments, and then we send in 23.8. Then you say, no, now it's 28, and we go, okay, keep doing the same stuff. Now you can have 28. And this implies they could say to us, by the way, like it was in World War II, we want 94% of your income. And under a static model, you know what we would do? Oh, you now want 94? I'll keep doing the same stuff. My behavior will not change, and I'll just send you 94 cents of every dollar I earn. This is ludicrous in the extreme. In 1979, there was an economist by the name of Arthur Laffer. He was a young guy at the University of Southern California, young economics professor at the time. He was having lunch one day with some friends, and they were talking about the lousy American economy. And Art Laffer pulled out a cocktail napkin and drew a diagram to illustrate his point. And the diagram's now named after him, and it's in every economics textbook. So it's kind of important. And this diagram became the foundation of a new way of thinking and looking at human behavior with respect to taxes. All right? So Laffer told his friends, look, we have tax revenue on the vertical axis and tax rates on the horizontal axis. The relationship between rates and revenue is not positive. It is convex. Translation for you algebra people, watch this. The argument was we need a model that sets tax revenue equal to intercept term plus coefficient on tax rates plus coefficient on tax rates. You got it? You've had algebra? Plus tax rates. What do you think? What is the only algebraic equation that can produce a convex or concave relationship? A quadratic equation. And a quadratic requires squaring terms that you suspect may have a parabolic relationship to the dependent variable. By parabolic, it means convex or concave. And then, of course, you go on with the rest of it. So anytime you're putting together an economic model and you believe that any variable you're picking might have concave or convex connections to the dependent variable, you square that term, and the algebra equation and the statistical software packages you use will show you whether or not you were right. So Laffer proposed this idea of dynamic scoring. Dynamic meaning things can change, behavior can change. And Laffer made the argument, please bear in mind, okay, backing up a little bit. He made the argument, if the government taxes us at 0%, the government will take in how much money? Zero. But unlike the static model, he argues if the government taxes us at 100%, it will also take in zero. There's proof of this, by the way. You'll see, I think, in chapter 3 of your book, during World War II, Roosevelt signed an executive order that created a 100% income tax on incomes above $25,000 a year. And you can read in the book to see what happened. The IRS came back and said that nobody's reporting income above $25,000. The entire country told Franklin Roosevelt, we'll pay up to a point. We're not going to give you everything we earn beyond this point. And so investments in tax-free municipal bonds, outright cheating, investments in sticking money in a can under your backyard if you have to, working for cash off the books. Laffer argued that there is a positive relationship. Watch this. The relationship between tax rates and tax revenue is positive up to a point. Thomas Jefferson once said the government should be able to run all of the affairs of the people with 4% of their money. So if we had a 4% tax on investments, would people still invest? Would they buy stocks and bonds and gold and real estate? Yes, because they think, wow, I'm still going to make a lot of profit. I only have to send the government 4%. And you can make the argument maybe under 10, 15, what have you. Laffer argued that there will become an optimal tax rate that creates maximum tax revenue. And if you've had calculus, you now know, oh, so once you reach the global maximum, the first derivative at that point is zero, meaning any cut in taxes or increase in taxes, you're moving away from the global maximum and your revenue would actually go down. So understand, watch this. Laffer argued that the relationship between tax rates and tax revenue is positive to a point because it will not harm incentives. That rich people, middle class people, and poor people will continue to work and strive and try to be more productive, take on second jobs, work overtime, seek promotions, seek advancements in their education. And if the tax rate is reasonable, they will go ahead and send in the money to the federal government, and it won't alter their incentives to work and be creative and start new businesses and things like this. But he said, beyond the ideal tax rate, beyond this point, the relationship between tax rates and tax revenue becomes negative. Any ideas why? Let's start with poor people. We're not doing capital gains tax right now. Let's just talk about, in general, the idea of tax rates and tax revenue with respect to the poor. Open up your books for just one moment. For those of you who have your books, and for my online students, it'll be the same books, it'll be the same page. Let me show you real quick what taxes look like. All right, for poor people. All right. Open your book to page 67, please. Okay, so this is the table of federal income taxes for the year 2014. Assuming laziness on my part, I may be using this lecture for quite a while, so your books in the future will reflect new tax rates, but I would imagine it won't show getting rid of the income tax, nor will it show major reduction. So for now, we can assume that into the future we're going to have this system here where it's called by the way, it's called a progressive income tax. This comes from the mind of Karl Marx. Karl Marx, in his book, The Communist Manifesto, written with Frederick Engels, argued that in order to transform a nation into a communist country, you needed progressive income taxes on people, meaning, by progressive, the more money you make, the bigger the percentage you ought to send to the federal government. That's their gift for your productivity. Okay, so you can see that your first tax rate you face is 10%. It's right there. It says incomes not over $9,075, tax is 10%. And then when you get over that amount, the tax rate becomes 15% for a while. And then you notice between $36,900 and $89,000, this is for a single person, your tax is 25%. So notice something here. Let's just look at the $36,900 figure, which would be lower middle class. If you continue through the tax tables, you'll notice it goes from 25 to 28%, and then 28 to 33, and then 33 to 35, and President Obama a couple years ago raised the top tax rate from 35 to now 39.6%, plus another almost 4% surcharge on the wealthy to pay for parts of Obamacare. So now, but notice what you have here. The biggest tax increase you'll ever face in your life is when you try to get out of being poor and go into the middle class. It goes from 0, if you're not working at all, to 10, 15, and 25%. By the time you're lower income, you're paying 1/4 of your income in taxes. And then notice it jumps from 0 to 25, and then it goes from 25 to 28, so you get a 3% increase, and then you get another 5%. The biggest increase you'll ever face is struggling to be a productive human being coming out of poverty. So for Art Laffer, he would argue that this means the incentives for a lot of poor people is to work for cash off the books. Or is this a shocking proposition to you guys? How many of you know of people, whether it's underreporting tips or working for cash only, not reporting stuff? How many of you know people? Well, this is being filmed, so don't raise your hand, even though it's back of your head. But maybe just kind of move your eyes funny. If you know of people that do this, it makes perfect sense because these people have this unique perception that it's their money. Isn't that a fascinating concept? They're thinking, I'm doing the work, it's my money, I'm going to try to keep it, so pay me cash only. Some people combine cash only with social welfare benefits, still getting food stamps and aid to families, dependent children. That's, by the way, that's perfectly rational, not constitutional in its original intent, but it's rational. If the government says, hey, we'll give you some, wow, okay, so now I'll make cash over here to take care of this, and I'll get social welfare benefits for this. So it alters the incentives of the poor to be honest and forthright and work above ground and say, here's the money I'm making, I'm going to report it, because they feel, and you can make the case that they feel correctly, that that's a big jump in taxation. They've got to pay now for it. Now think about it. You start working, and now you've got to pay for daycare for your kids, right? You may have to buy insurance now. There's a lot of other things you have to do, gas, tolls, dealing with people at your work. And so there's a lot of other costs associated with work too. So you have to deal with all those expenses now and also big increases in your taxes. So for a lot of people it makes sense to try to avoid paying those taxes and hiding the money. For middle income families, it ends up making sense for them. Watch. Guys, if this trend in taxation continues, some of you will have a very interesting conversation like I used to have with my wife several years ago. She used to bring up from time to time, hey, if I worked part-time doing something extra income, or if she's a very bright economics and finance student, or maybe if I work full-time. But in the past when I would show her, okay, here's my income, and if we add your income to mine, I don't know if you guys know this, but there's something called a marriage penalty. And what that is, it's a wedding gift from the Internal Revenue Service, where when you combine your incomes, you jump into an even higher income tax bracket, which means after taxes, you look at what you're taking home after child care and dry cleaning and gas and tolls, and that second income ends up being on the margin, or in terms of the extra benefit, to be highly questionable as a rational pursuit. So I used to be able to show her mathematically, look, it would make no sense. Okay, here's the income, here's the new taxes and everything else. Wow, this is all I'd be bringing home? Yeah. Well, I think I'll stay home with the kids. Yeah, it makes sense, okay? Some of you, I know this has happened to me sometimes. I've had to question, I've been offered chances to do certain projects. Well, can I say that? Yeah, I can say it because it's legal. All right, so this past year, I instructed my publisher not to cut me my royalty check in November like they usually do, but to cut it this January. Because when I looked at where my brackets were based on other things I'd done during the course of the year, I noticed if I get that royalty check in November, it's going to shoot me up into the next bracket. The IRS is going to file an even bigger claim on my money. And so I said, do not send the check until January to hold down. So what additional revenue did President Obama's administration get from me last year when it came to the books? Nothing. Nothing. I won't have to deal with them now until April the 15th, 2016, because it's 2015 income, and I'm one of the last people at the post office going, here it is, here's my property, going to the Internal Revenue Service, and of course cursing all the way home. So they got nothing from me. Now, the Art Laffer's argument is when the middle class feels like they're squeezed too much by taxes, it alters behavior. How many of you remember the very first time you worked overtime? You remember that? I know why you remember it, because they told you about an interesting rule that when you work overtime, you get time and a half. So I remember the first time I worked overtime, the whole week, I was like a calculator, right? I was thinking, okay, I've hit my hours, now time and a half, bang, and I was just multiplying and bang, and I was projecting what my check would be, and I was excited, and I got the check, and I remember looking at it, excuse me, something's wrong here. This seems to be time and a third, not time and a half. And I remember actually taking the check to the payroll people and saying, what is this? And they explained that the IRS doesn't recognize this time and a half as a temporary boost to your income. It recognized you in the higher tax bracket as if that might be permanent. And so that extra income shoved me into a higher tax bracket. And the IRS basically said, thank you, Jack, for working all weekend. Instead of doing things that were fun, we're now going to file a bigger claim on your private property. And I remember the second time I was offered overtime, I told them it's not worth it, and the IRS got nothing. So it alters the incentives of people to work more, create more, be more productive when they believe that those extra dollars. Guys, remember, pay doesn't matter. Net pay is all that matters, right? You've got gross. You know what gross pay is, right? That's what you look at. And you say to yourself, oh man, could I just touch that for a few minutes? And the IRS says, shut up. Don't even look at gross. And from gross, deduction, you look at net, and that's what we get to live on. So net, to Art Laffer, is what really matters. And if rising levels of taxation reduces net pay, it alters the incentives to work, create, save, be productive, and what have you. Now, this is where you've got to open your minds and pay close attention. The biggest effect, Laffer argued, was on rich people. See, if you raise my taxes, it means that maybe I wait an extra year or two before I pay somebody $4,000 to repaint my house. Or maybe I don't buy a new television set. You feel like your taxes are going up. Like when your payroll taxes went up a couple of years ago, you probably noticed that. Maybe you eat pizza one less time a month. So it depends on your income. You raise the taxes of people in the upper brackets, and it alters their incentives to start new companies, to hire new people, to engage in new research and development endeavors. So let's just think about this for just a moment. So watch this. You heard the guy in the debate moderator say that when Clinton cut the capital gains tax from 28% to 20%, what happened to tax revenue? It went up. When Bush cut it from 20 to 15, what happened to revenue? It went up. Okay, so first of all, this should put many of you at ease. So whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, this is the best part of all. We had a Democrat lower it dramatically from what it was under arguably the all-time hero of the Republican Party. So we got the 28 under Reagan down to 20, and revenues went up. Bush, a Republican, lowered it even more to 15. By the way, Bill Clinton, the tax used to have to pay a capital gains tax on your home. If you bought a house and then you sold it and you made a profit on your house, you have to pay a capital gains tax. He cut that tax to zero. He said if you live in your house, they believe it's 2 or 3 years, and you sell it and you make a profit, you can keep it all. So Democrats and Republicans have both seen the wisdom and the good mathematics of saying, okay, make an investment and we'll let you keep more of your money. So what this meant was that under the Clinton and Bush years, okay, let's say we're out here at 28% collecting this level of tax revenue when Clinton takes office in 1992. So Clinton cut it from 28 to 20, and tax revenue under Bill Clinton actually went up. Now, this is not a discussion of what you then should do with the tax revenue. Okay, that is another day, another time. The question is, what will happen to revenue? Because Mr. Obama's current pitch is to raise the rates to get more revenue to provide for free community college education. But he's got the last two presidents preceding him showing them that cutting the rates actually leads to more revenue. And for those of you still confused about how that could happen, watch this. When you're facing a capital gains tax rate of 28%, think about how it might affect your investment strategy. I mean, there's two types of investors: people who tend to be more risk averse, kind of scared, and people who are risk lovers, kind of like to roll the dice and take more chances. So in a 28% tax rate environment, it's going to encourage more people to be, which one? Risk averse. Play it safe. Now, again, usually playing it safe means a lower rate of return, but a higher probability of a rate of return. But since you're playing it safe, once you sell it, you haven't made that much profit, and so it's 28% of a small amount of profit, so the government gets a small amount of revenue. Clinton comes along and says, I'll tell you what, send us just 20%. And so now you've got more people thinking, okay, I can afford to be more risk-loving. I can take more chances, because if it pays off, now it's going to pay off huge, because I only have to pay 20% instead of 28%. So first of all, it encourages more overall investment. That's clear. That's just human behavior. That just makes sense. If anybody comes to you and says, listen, I've got one proposal where I'll reward you by 28%, the other I'll reward you by 20%, you're going to pick 28%. If I say I've got one that's going to punish you by 20% or punish you by 28%, you're going to pick to be punished by 20%. It's just common sense that incentives would be affected. So now you're going to have more people investing and a lot more people taking riskier investments with higher payoffs, and so that leads to a greater pool of profit from those investments. And so at the lower rate, at 20% of a big pie, think of it. If somebody were to ask you, hey, I'll give you 28% of a slice of a pie or 20% of a slice of pie, first question ought to be, how big are the pies? You say, well, I'll give you 20% of a pie this big, or I'll give you 20% or 28% of a pie this big. Take the 20% of the big. And so what Clinton discovered was that by cutting the rates, it led to more of this behavior. And look at what investments are, guys. The unemployment rate fell to less than 4% while Bill Clinton was president. His last 6 years. If Hillary becomes president, I have one wish for her, other than the marriage part, to act like Bill. His last 6 years. Because his last 6 years with the Roth IRA and cuts in capital gains, 0% tax on sale of a house, it led to so much investment behavior. And investments means investing in new businesses, new products, new ideas, new research endeavors. And you know what all that means? You have to hire people, and now they have jobs. Bush, for as many mistakes that he did make, he had the intelligence say, okay, if 20's working, let's try it again. So he cut it to 15. So let's erase this over here. Cut it to 15, and tax revenues went up even more. So now we have President Fairness, who's got it back to 23.8, and he wants it raised back to 28%. And you saw also the moderator point out that when it went to 28% while Reagan was president, what happened to tax revenue? It went down. So let me get this straight. First of all, we have the question as to whether or not we have the constitutional legitimacy to take away somebody's money to send your future kids to community college. And then the economic legitimacy of it comes under question too. Because if you assume $320 billion new dollars and you raise the rates and it reduces overall investor behavior, changes the type of investments taking place, now you're back to shrinking the pool of revenue. So you take 28% again from a smaller pool, and you know what's going? They'll still do the free community college. The national debt will simply continue to grow, because the revenue will not show up. You raise the rates and the revenue drops, and you still have the program in effect, and people get, like Roosevelt said, welfare becomes the subtle destroyer of the human spirit. It becomes a narcotic. Once people get used to the idea, look, even people like me who are opposed to plunder, Once they get used to the idea of their kids getting free community college education, if somebody comes around years later when they've got their second, third, or fourth kid getting ready to go to school and says, listen, we're going to get rid of this program. Look, they've already altered their behavior and their budgets and their types of their vacations, how often they eat out. That's how human beings are. Ooh, I'm saving money on the community college stuff. Now we can go out to dinner more often. You get used to that stuff. And somebody comes along and says, we're going to take that away now. We never should have done it to begin with. And they're so used to this being part of their lives. There's no way. Even well-meaning people who don't like plunder, who've gotten used to receiving plunder, are going to say, yeah, let's get rid of this program. So you're going to have falling revenues, growing programs. And remember, we already talked about with the expanding enrollment's going to take place because of the shift in demand towards community college. And you have to expand the number of facilities and professors. All you're doing is threatening an even bigger and bigger program with declining revenues to pay for it. National debt increases, and an increase in the national debt simply means it postpones the income tax increase on you that you'll pay in the future for the program that gets implemented today. I want to show you two presidents who had ideas on different ways to fund community college education. But do you have any questions before I do that? And don't be reluctant because the camera's on you. Questions about anything we've done here with the static and dynamic analysis before we get to those gentlemen? Yes?
Maybe just a brief overview. What is the opposing argument to this? Because this seems so...
It makes sense, doesn't it? Yes. Well, here's the problem. We have universal suffrage and a largely economically illiterate voting public. So how often do you even hear people say, free is impossible? More people that I've talked to keep using the word. Free community, even people who I know to be relatively intelligent, still believe somehow free, okay? So if people can't even wrap their heads around the concept that nothing is free, somebody will have to pay. And it gets paid by taxes either now or in the future. Imagine trying to wrap their heads around quadratic equations and convex functions and behavioral responses. Now, when they hear it, it makes a lot of sense. But understand again, every time I go vote, here's what's depressing. I've devoted my life to understanding these concepts and then trying to vote for people who also understand them. And in front of me is someone who does not, and in back of me is someone who does not, probably. And that means they've doubled the amount of votes in the opposite direction of mine. So you devote your whole life to understanding, and just because somebody turned 18, they get to cancel out your votes times 2. So it builds in an incentive for politicians to talk about things that the economically illiterate voting public can wrap their heads around. And they can't wrap their heads around, wait a second, if you raise taxes on capital gains, you're going to alter investment behavior, and that's going to reduce the overall pool of tax revenue from which you tax it, so the higher rate will lead to less revenue. If it leads to less revenue, we're going to have a big national debt, and we're going to have all these problems of overcrowded community colleges, and so that's going to expand the debt even further. All you're doing to them is throwing out the word free, right? And it makes it so much more palatable for people to hear free than it does. Look, you guys were forced to take economics, and because you care about your grade, you are here listening to this right now. But giving the choice of a rap concert down at the SSB or you being here, if it didn't affect your grade, you'd have thousands over there. Okay, watch this. I advertise a lecture on the Laffer curve for free. 100 yards from a rap concert. Both are free to the public. There will be 4 people listening to me, and within seconds they'll say, I thought there was a rap concert, and I'll say, well, it's over there, and they'll leave. So I'll talk to myself, and there'll be thousands listening to this guy use the F word every other second. That is what politicians understand. So it's perfectly rational for him to stand there and tell the American people, look, remember what Bastiat said? Bastiat said, in man's natural state, we seek to avoid pain and will live at the expense of someone else if we can. So here it is. Remember what Moses came down, for billions of years, God doesn't talk to anybody. The one dude he talks to and writes down some rules for us, 20% of the rules are what I'm talking about right now. 20%. Thou shalt not covet and thou shalt not steal. What do politicians do? The rich have this money over here. Covet, covet. You can't break into Zuckerberg's house. So I'll do it for you, and I'll take his stuff legally through the law, and I'll redirect it to you so you can live at the expense of someone else. Because it's easier to live at the expense of someone else than it is to say, oh dear, I have children and they're about to start college. What shall we do? I need to take responsibility for these human beings. To be honest with you, what I'm saying right now is politically foolish. He makes so much more sense than I do politically, because this goes back to personal responsibility and not envying and not coveting and not believing you have a right to somebody else's stuff. And that's hard. That's really hard. What he's proposing is easy. Now let me get to the two people who I think could help President Obama. Here we go. All right. Yes.
One quick question. So I'm guessing tax revenue did go down from 20 to 23.8%.
The data's not totally in yet on it. It's not in on what's happening so far with the increase that Mr. Obama's already pushed through. All right, JFK on income taxes. Okay, pay very close attention to this. It's one of my favorite ones.
The worst deficit comes from a recession. And if we can take the proper action in the proper time, this can be the most important step we could take to prevent another recession. That is the right kind of a tax cut, both for your family budget and the national budget, resulting from a permanent basic reform and reduction in our rate structure, a creative tax cut, creating more jobs and income, and eventually more revenue. And the right time for that kind of bill, it now appears, in the absence of an economic crisis today, and if the job is to be done in a responsible way, is January 1963. Such a bill will be presented to the Congress for action next year. It will include an across-the-board, top-to-bottom cut in both corporate and personal income taxes. It will include long-needed tax reforms that logic and equity demand. And it will date that cut in taxes to take effect as of the start of next year, January 1963. The billions of dollars this bill will place in the hands of the consumer and our businessmen will have both immediate and permanent benefits to our economy. Every dollar released from taxation that is spent or invested will help create a new job and a new salary. And these new jobs and new salaries can create other jobs and other salaries, and more customers and more growth for an expanding American economy. Instead of being permanently saddled with excess planned capacity and the budgetary deficit that is created by this means, our goal must be full capacity and full employment and the budgetary surpluses that that kind of employment and capacity can produce.
Now, if you did not get all of that, we'll go back over it because it is critical to your short-run goals, the test, and I hope your long-run goals of being an economically literate human being. And this is one of my all-time favorite clips. So it shows up since you were babies. It's been showing up on tests, okay? Now, for those of you who do not know, this is President John Kennedy, and he was a, what? Democrat. All right. So we've already talked about the Democrat Bill Clinton cutting capital gains taxes and what happened. Now we have the Democrat John F. Kennedy talking about income taxes. Now notice what he said. Let me see if I can go about it this way. What if the newspaper article said this? President Obama called for lowering income and capital gains taxes for all Americans, stating that the economy is still in a fragile recovery and in need of momentum, and therefore he proposed lowering the capital gains and income tax rates to 10% and cited as his guidance on this issue the 1963 across-the-board tax cuts passed by President John F. Kennedy. See, look at the difference. Kennedy, did you hear Kennedy doing any of the envy stuff? Did you understand what he was saying to the American people? He said he wanted an across-the-board, top-to-bottom cut in both personal and corporate income taxes. He wanted corporations to pay less, he wanted the rich to pay less, the middle class to pay less, and the poor to pay less. And he said every dollar released from taxation, and think about it again, all you got to do is put $1 in your hand and ask the simple question. Okay, one of two places where this dollar can go. I can keep it from my work, or I can send it to the IRS. President Obama says they're going to send it to the IRS, and he assumes the revenue is going to show up, because the government knows best. The government somehow knows that community college education is so important that we must do this. But watch what else he could have said during this speech. He could have said, Mr. Obama, he could have said, this cut in the income tax for everyone will create an enormous increase in people's net incomes and will make it therefore easier for people to pay for college, whether it be community or university education. Do you understand what I just said? So this was a president who wanted to reward businesses and individuals by allowing them to keep more of their money. By the way, the night he gave this speech, the top income tax rate was 91%. It used to be, in 1962, in December, if you were a hardworking, productive American who was making a lot of money, you kept 9 cents of every dollar you earned, the material's in your book, and you sent to the Internal Revenue Service 91 cents. He got the top rate cut to 70, so you're still sending 70 if you were wildly successful, but he got all the other rates cut too, and the data's also in your book. The 1960s was a boom time in the United States. And notice he also, Mr. Kennedy, did Art Laffer before Art Laffer. The Laffer curve was 1979. But here you have a Democrat in 1962 predicting that if taxes were cut, what did he say would happen to revenue for the government? He said it would go up. He said every dollar released from taxation is a new job and a new salary. And those jobs and salaries create other jobs and other salaries. John F. Kennedy understood the case for how to create a growing economy, not by punishing some and giving their property to someone else, but by not punishing anyone and instead rewarding everybody who's working. This is a very different environment that we're in now. Instead of saying to all American people, look, you go work, and whether you're Oprah or the guy down here at McDonald's, we're going to let you keep more of your hard-earned money. And you'll be able to do more things with that as a result. And there will be more jobs and more businesses as a result. Kennedy believed this. Now, what's important here is for you Democrats in here and you Democrats watching online, what's great about this is that you now have evidence from both the Kennedy tax cuts, all the data's in your book, and the Clinton tax cuts, and while in Clinton's second term the economy boomed again, it's the last boom time we've ever had in this country, of two Democrats who vehemently opposed the Obama idea of raising taxes either in the name of fairness, whatever that means, or of getting more revenue from the 1%. So you can stay a Democrat, but be economically literate. It's very simple. And you Republicans, I'm about to throw you a big bone too. We're going to go look at your hero, Ronald Reagan, in a speech he gave in 1985. Let's take a look.
In 1981, our critics charged that letting you keep more of your earnings would trigger an inflationary explosion, send interest rates soaring, and destroy our economy. Well, we cut your tax rates anyway, by nearly 25%. And what that helped trigger was falling inflation, falling interest rates, and the strongest economic expansion in 30 years. Over the course of this century, our tax system has been modified dozens of times and in hundreds of ways. Yet most of those changes didn't improve the system. They made it more like Washington itself, complicated, unfair, cluttered with gobbledygook and loopholes designed for those with the power and influence to hire high-priced legal and tax advisors. But there's more to it than that. Some years ago, an historian, I believe, said that every time in the past when a government began taxing above a certain level of the people's earnings, trust in government began to erode. He said it would begin with efforts to avoid paying the full tax. This would become outright cheating and eventually a distrust and contempt of government itself until there would be a breakdown in law and order. Well, how many times have we heard people brag about clever schemes to avoid paying taxes, or watched luxuries casually written off to be paid for by somebody else, that somebody being you? I believe that in both spirit and substance, our tax system has come to be un-American. How would the proposal work? The present tax system has 14 different brackets of tax rates ranging from 11 to 50%. We would take a giant step toward an ideal system by replacing all that with a simple 3-bracket system with tax rates of 15, 25, and 35%. By lowering everyone's tax rates all the way up the income scale, each of us will have a greater incentive to climb higher, to excel, to help America grow. The power of these incentives would send one simple, straightforward message to an entire nation. America, go for it. To young Americans wondering tonight, where will I go? What will I do with my future? I have a suggestion. Why not set out with your friends on the path of adventure and try to start up your own business? Follow in the footsteps of those 2 college students who launched one of America's great computer firms from the garage behind their house. You too can help us unlock the doors to a golden future. You too can become leaders in this great new era of progress, the age of the entrepreneur.
If I had a wish that didn't involve my self-interest, I would wish that all of my students could have experienced what it was like to be young and in college while that man was president. I told you earlier I'm a registered die-hard libertarian, which means I make fun of Republicans and Democrats with equal zeal. But being a libertarian affords you the opportunity to compliment both parties when they do something smart. I think I paid President Reagan the ultimate compliment when I named my youngest son after him, much to the chagrin of my Democratic parents. So, when Reagan took office in 1981, the top income tax rate was 70%. Kennedy got it from 91 to 70. It stayed 70 from 1963 all the way to 81. Reagan signed the Economic Recovery Tax Act in 1981, which brought the top rate down to 50, as you just saw, but we still had 14 different brackets. So we have half a dozen now, but you still climbed and you climbed and you climbed. So when I was in high school, I was facing the prospect that if you go to college and you work hard, you'll keep 6 months of your earnings and the government will take the other 6 months. And this is just income tax. This doesn't count property taxes, sales taxes. So you were still, when I was a young person, a teenager, I knew that, because my original major was accounting until I realized I couldn't figure out the difference between a debit and a credit. So I knew, though, that I was going to, whatever I earned, the government was going to take more than half of it. So when I was still in high school, when I got to college, it was still that way. And in '85, Reagan gave this speech. And in '86, I'll never forget, by the way, you saw him say we want to reduce it down to 3 brackets, with the highest being 35. He was so good at negotiation that we got the 15% bracket, but they split the difference on the 25 and 35%, and the top income tax rate fell to 28%. So when I was in high school, when I started high school, the top income tax rate was 70%. Reagan got it to 50, then he got to 28. And I will never forget, I was in my Principles of Microeconomics class at the University of Oklahoma, and we all were required to read the Wall Street Journal. And when this passed, imagine today, I mean, nobody does this today. I saw multiple people coming in the classroom with their Wall Street Journal, pointing to the headlines. You would have thought they were pointing to something about somebody winning the national championship or who won the Super Bowl. But people were going crazy over the tax bill that had passed the night before, because now Ronald Reagan was saying to college students, hey, if you do well and you get out, here's the deal. Send us 28%, not 70, not half. You keep 72 cents on the dollar and you send us 28. And we were euphoric. I remember this one kid from California said, I can go back to California now. And he was talking about the business he was going to start. It was a complete Completely different and so hopeful and optimistic. Have you, in 6 years President Obama's been president, have you ever heard him talk about people, about go out and start a new business and be a risk taker and maybe you'll make all this money? Have you ever heard him talk about that at all? Profit and income and wealth has become dirty words in this country. And again, I started teaching in 1987, Reagan's last 2 years, and my students, when I was a graduate student at Oklahoma, my students understood this. You never heard anybody complaining about it. They were euphoric, they just couldn't wait to graduate, to go out and pursue their self-interest and make money. And by the way, the 1980s, which was also a boom time in the United States, boom time, also was one of the biggest increases in charitable giving we've ever seen in our country's history. Go back and look at the data, the history of charitable giving in the United States. People had so much money that charities thrived. They call it the decade of greed. What it was the decade of removing government from your private property and then letting people decide whether they were going to give to charity or keep it or whatever they were going to do. But now, in the last few years of my career here, I'm in the depressing position of having most of my students kind of resigned to the idea, well, we now live in a country where the government thinks they know best, and the percentage they're going to take from us is going up, and the debt's going up, and they keep saying this is going to be the new rule, and it actually is kind of sad. I just hope I'm able to teach long enough where another Kennedy or another Reagan comes along, or if Hillary comes along and does like Bill, meaning she lies while she's running for president, and then when she becomes president, she acts like she has some good sense when it comes to economics. Maybe she'll be the one. But we are wrapping up 16 consecutive years, in effect, of presidents who struggle to understand markets and freedom, especially this current president we have, who seems to want to continually make the point that if you have less than someone else, it's their fault. And so we're going to go get their stuff and give it to you. Instead of telling you, I'll tell you what, if you have less than someone else, I've got an idea for how you can make more money and they can make more money. We're going to get out of your wallets, we're going to get out of your lives, set you free from government intrusion, but then it'll be on you. If you still make less money than somebody else, a mirror will help explain that problem. Have a good day.